But let's move on to migration, which seems to have fueled the biggest population increase in years in the UK. That's according to the Office for National Statistics. The figures came out yesterday. Here are the figures. Population rose by almost 610,000 to officially 60.9 million between mid-22 and the middle of last year. That's the biggest increase since 1949. When comparable records began. I'm sure that's an underestimate. I'm pretty sure. Sorry, the population is bigger than that. The office said that the growth was largely down to record levels of net migration, which has been a very big issue for politicians. It stood at 622,000 for the year to mid-2023. So it's not birth, it's migration that's causing this. Here to tell us more and give us his thoughts is the spokesman for the Homeland Party, Alec Cave. Alec, welcome to today's News Talk, TNT.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Let's start with your party. What's your party stand for?
Well, it's primarily a nationalist party, so opposing mass migration is the number one issue for us. But we also hold traditional social values. We feel that there's been a total social decay in this country. And we also, because we have a nationalist philosophy, we want to have, obviously, independence and sovereignty for our country. So we support Brexit. And we are very much alarmed by the fact that we've had globalization, which is taking our independence away. And then, obviously, mass migration is completely undermining our way of life and taking away our sovereignty. And we find that totally unacceptable.
So very clear agenda there, clear narrative. What do you make of these figures? 61 million thereabouts for England and Wales. That excludes Scotland and Northern Ireland. So I guess we're pushing almost 70 million or maybe 67 million now.
Yeah, when I heard the stats, I thought that's a bit low. Eurostats have it a bit higher. But yes, it's still incredibly high, isn't it? And it's just going to get higher and higher. Do the people want this? No, they don't. But we're going to have this population explosion continue, even though it's unsustainable, partly because there's a globalist agenda to obviously flood European countries with migrants from across the world because it breaks down social cohesion and makes us easier to govern. But it's also our economic model, where we have this model where we have to keep the GDP rising because we've got endless debt and we need to keep paying interest off on that debt as well. So, yeah, it's a pickle.
There is a point which was made actually by Nigel Farage, for example, and I think your party's made it. The gross domestic product's going up, but the gross domestic product per head is going down because more people means, generally speaking, more turnover, but not necessarily more wealth. What would you say to those who do argue that we need to have net migration to keep the economy growing?
Well, I say life shouldn't be about serving the economy, and the economy doesn't need to infinitely grow. An economy should work for the ordinary people. So absolutely, mass migration has undermined the incomes of ordinary people. Sure, the pie has grown bigger, but people's share of it has not increased. And that's why it's so pernicious what's being done. If anything, I would actually welcome the economy shrinking a little bit. One of our agendas is we actually want to reverse mass migration. We think it's in everybody's interest to actually encourage these recent migrants that have been allowed to flood into our country over the past quarter of a century, to actually encourage them to go back. And many people would be alarmed at this, like, oh my God, you couldn't possibly have lots of people leaving. Think about the economy, etc. It's like, well, actually, if you shrink the population a bit, house prices will come down because the amount of housing stock will stay the same, but the demand will go down. And then also people's wages will increase because there'll be a labour shortage. So ordinary working people will be better off.
That's not an argument I've heard before. I recognise, though, that house prices will go down if demand, or at least they won't rise so fast if demand goes down. That's interesting. But if you've got lots of houses, pretty great if you haven't got any. In terms of the argument about migration, which is legal and illegal, do you have a handle on the extent to which this migration is actually legal? Because I get the impression that most of the increase is actually legally permitted and likely to carry on so under the Labour Party.
Well, this is one of the frustrating things since we've had this explosion in small boats crossings over the past few years, is it's obviously taken people's attention on illegal migration, and it's understandable. It's an obvious in-your-face violation of our borders. The fact that we literally don't know who these people are, at least with legal migrants, the government's going to ask who they are, what their occupation is, etc. But with these so-called refugees, we literally have no clue who they are. So it's a security risk. Whenever you have these migrants put up in hotels, there's always going to be police present because there's going to be danger, there's havoc. And that's extremely alarming and concerning to people. And we know that some of these refugees have gone on to commit egregious crimes. I remember last year, they started putting hotels in Skegness, migrants in hotels, and then unfortunately a young girl got raped in the park. I mean, that should never have been allowed to happen. But this is the consequence of not properly enforcing our borders. But I'll go back to my point about illegal migration. I don't want to say it's a distraction, but it does take our attention away from, obviously, the elephant in the room, which is the ginormous legal migration we've been getting. We've been getting it for the past quarter of a century. But frankly, under Boris Johnson, it was him that allowed over 1 million immigrants per year after the COVID pandemic, which is absolutely insane and outrageous.
It's ironic that the Conservatives used to say they were tough on migration, but presided over the largest leap in migration in a single month in recent history, in a single year in recent history last year. And same way that they said they were party of low tax. But I'm wondering why we get these figures which say something like 43,212 people crossed the channel, when you know as well as I do, they're just the ones we know about. There'll be loads of people coming across that we don't even know.
Yeah, people coming across on lorries and other boats and other ways of getting in. So there will be perhaps even millions of people that we don't know who are here, that are part of the black economy, and they're undocumented. So who knows? Maybe our population could be as high as 75 million or even more. We just don't know. And frankly, our government doesn't care to know either.
I had the impression when I watched the general election campaign in which the Labour Party missed one word from their change slogan, the word no, because I think there'll be no change. But I observed that Labour sounded like they were going to slack off on it, make it easier to come into this country. What's your prognosis of the likely impact of a change in government to migration numbers?
I don't think it'll be a whole lot. We've got to remember, you've got the entrenched bureaucracy, and they obviously, to a large extent, are controlling how many numbers are coming in. Remember, a lot of these governments and politicians can be quite lazy and just allow the bureaucracy to make all the decisions. And I think they've decided that they are going to bring immigration down a little bit. I think part of the motivation for having such high migration after COVID links back to the fact that the economy was so damaged. So they want to get warm bodies into the economy, right, just to stimulate growth and productivity. But I think it's going to come down a little bit because the bureaucracy's decided. But also, if Labour do reduce it even by a tiny bit, then rhetorically they can go on television and say they've reduced immigration, which isn't technically a lie, even though it's still insanely high numbers. So I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if we see the numbers come down a bit. But obviously, it's still astronomically high, and it's completely wrong, and we're opposed to it.
If you were the Home Secretary, then let's elevate you to that role, or maybe demote, depending how you feel about it. If you were the Home Secretary, what would you do? What would be your policy?
Well, we'd leave the European Convention of Human Rights and start taking these small boats back to France or wherever, frankly. And we would cease all immigration completely. The only immigration we would allow are people of, British ancestry or expats, if they want to return home. But we need a complete moratorium on immigration. People say that, we need immigration for the economy, etc. Well, hang on a minute. how many millions of people have we let in? If we need these migrants, surely we've let in more than enough if they're so needed over the past few decades. So frankly, we've already got all the immigrants we need, surely. So we would have a total moratorium. And like I said a few moments ago, we would actually reverse migration. So we would create incentives to encourage people to go back, because life doesn't revolve around the economy. You know, there's things like quality of life as well. And this country is our homeland. It's for our people. And our way of life is being fundamentally changed by importing people from across the globe in a way that not only did we not ask for, but we don't want. We want to return our country back to feeling like it's quintessentially ours again, like it's our homeland, where our people can express themselves. We don't want multiculturalism. And so that's why we also have a policy of wanting to encourage people to return home.
One final question, though. The employee relocation sector would argue that about 65,000 people a year do come into this country. They're essential if we want to attract inward investment. Why would you include those high value people who make a net contribution? I know you say the economy isn't everything, but they make a net contribution by creating jobs and preventing companies from going somewhere else. Why would you exclude them? Many of them will be foreign nationals.
Well, again, it comes back to it's not all about the economy. And actually what we want to have is a sovereign country that's independent, that, you know, has its own manufacturing base, that can create all of the things it needs for its own people. We don't want to be dependent on rich international businessmen to have an economy. That's completely perverse. So the idea that we have to have these high-skilled people, well, we should be training our own people. This is the thing. We have not invested in our own people in this country. And that's part of the reason why we need these people with high skills.
Alec Cave, real pleasure to speak with you. We'll return to this, I'm sure, and with you as well. That's Alec Cave from Homeland Party.